Well, folks, thanks for joining us again today. I'm joined by Peter Furst from the Head of Incident Response at Emergence Insurance. We're incredibly lucky to have him here. We have a private schools executive roundtable later today, and he's generously given his time. So, Peter, welcome. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me. It's always good to find an excuse to come up to Brisbane.
Are you enjoying the weather?
Actually, it's very hot in Sydney, so I don't know, it's finally come good after a couple of terrible months in Sydney where it was cold and wet.
I like my visits to Sydney. It's a great place.
Yeah, I like the harbour. It's a nice place to live. It's nice catching the ferry into work every day as well.
I'm very envious of that. I remember my times actually living on the river here in Brisbane and doing the same thing. Anytime I had to go to town for work, I'd jump on the ferry. It's a nice way to start the day.
Definitely is.
Particularly given what it is that you do as a profession. Being the head of incident response, I suspect, looking at the fact that there's 2 phones on the desk here, your time can be very, very busy from time to time.
Yeah, I think whenever you're in a high-stress environment, anything you can do that takes a bit of that edge off is very good, whether it be getting out of town to do things like this or catching the ferry in or walking over the bridge home. It's really nice.
So there's no particular agenda for today, as you know. We just really want to see where the conversation flows. So given what we're planning to talk about at the event later today, is there anything that you want to share with the audience?
Well, I guess, there's so many things. I've been over 800 plus matters right now. I've seen everything from little socially engineered thefts through to enterprise level ransomware attacks. Pretty much you name it, we've seen it.
Is there anyone in particular that comes to mind or one that might be in flight at the moment?
Yeah, there's a number. I guess considering we're talking about schools today, one that teacher had basically given their credentials to a student so they could do some printing and didn't realize that with those credentials, they could actually get into what's effectively the CRM for the students. And so the students passed around these credentials. They actually changed their grades. They were able to view information on other students. And for us, this is a nightmare scenario. You can imagine a private school. It's such a juicy story. It's kind of like a Ferris Bueller's Day Off kind of thing if, students are getting in there and running the madhouse. But we managed to handle it very well. With the right messaging in place, you can calm down, reactions. And somehow it didn't get into the media, which I find amazing because we did notify the parents about it. The teacher involved has taken up another occupation. Let's put it that way.
I'm confused though. There's so much education about the importance of using different passwords for different systems. And I suspect, could be speculation here, that the teacher involved had been educated around the importance of using unique passwords on different systems.
Yeah, I think that's part of what contributed to his early retirement from the schooling is that the education was there, but it was not implemented in a satisfactory way, let's put it that way.
So I had a conversation with someone in security awareness training based in WA earlier this week, and she's doing her PhD. She actually said that there was a study that was done over tens of thousands of people that did their security awareness training over a 12-month period, and they found that the efficacy rate of security awareness training only improved by about 1% to 2% as a byproduct of that.
I've not seen that study, but it wouldn't surprise me. I think, we obviously prioritize training as part of a proper cybersecurity posture. It needs to be in there, education, particularly, recognizing phishing emails, being aware of fraud, knowing if someone contacts you with updated bank details to, double check via a different medium. We've had somewhere the threat actor's gone and it's an email compromise. They've updated the bank details and then the insured has just emailed back going, "Oh, you've updated your details. Is this correct?" At which point, of course, the threat actor's going,
yes,
yeah, absolutely. So, the training is essential, but I think also we're starting to see training fatigue. You get in those emails, we do it, I think, every second week, a new kind of little assignment will come through to all the staff that we have to click through. And you do kind of just now click, click, click. Obviously, I've got a fairly good idea about security measures, so it gets through pretty quickly. But I think a lot of people, fundamentally, it's just that they're busy doing their actual job and they're not aware of how integral cyber is until it goes wrong. People definitely learn afterwards. I think a cyber incident really is a real life pen test, and people do learn out of that. And I always say, never let a crisis go to waste. So most people, unfortunately, until you put your hand on the boiling water, you kind of don't realize that you shouldn't.
Yeah, and some of the conversations I've had with clients around efficacy of security awareness training is about not only making it relatable to the role that they do within the business, but also how it applies to them outside of work. So if the training is potent and effective enough that they can relate it to their personal life, it's far more effective inside the commercial life, because there are some people who just have the mindset of, well, it's not my responsibility, it's the company's responsibility to keep the environment secure. And I think given to what you mentioned just a moment ago about this CRM system, there are other technical layers that could have been deployed to help prevent such things like a user recycling the same password over and over, multi-factor authentication. Do you know if the system that they had that capability?
It may have had the capability. I don't want to name it and shame it in case I'm wrong. But I think you need to believe in security in depth, right?
Yes.
And there's a lot of factors for that. Education is one part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, things like conditional access controls, MFA would have been helpful here. Even just logging, so if when, kids had changed grades or things like that, you could see, and surely that should trigger an alert if suddenly grades from 2 months ago are getting changed. That's the kind of thing you'd think could come up in an alert. And I guess broader than that, the idea of the principle of least privilege, and that should apply not just to individuals, but also to software. And here you've got to wonder if someone was given credentials so they could print some documents, how that same set of credentials could be used to change marks. It's a little baffling for me that this could happen.
Typically what I say to an organization, if they're talking about things like MFA, multi-factor authentication, which we'll dive into a little bit more, my response to them when they talk about the pushback from their staff is a marginal level of inconvenience for you translates to a significant level of inconvenience for a threat actor.
I think like one example of that, in a sense, is the presentation that I sent through to you for today.
Mm-hmm.
So our systems are set up so you can't plug in a USB for data transfer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's intentionally so that there's no way you can get a malware payload put in through the USB port. So instead, I emailed it to you. You've got security measures in place that wouldn't take a file that was that big, and so then you did have to set up a SharePoint folder that I could upload into. And yeah, it is a bit of inconvenience, but it also means that my laptop and our environment is secure because the USB is disabled,
Mm-hmm.
and your environment is also more secure because you're not getting, large potentially, payloaded documents, PDFs, and PowerPoints that can be used to, harm your environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it would be reasonable for the operator to have a level of frustration, perhaps as a byproduct of these safety measures that are in place. But I suspect, speaking for myself, there's an understanding. These are here to keep my environment secure, and just like that, you have your settings in security posture set to keep your environment secure. So with that understanding, there's a level of tolerance, and going back to what I said a moment ago, it's marginally inconvenient for us, but for a threat actor to compromise your environment would be significantly harder than for someone who didn't have those security settings and that security posture in place. And so I think when we're talking to clients around that side of things, it's about having that awareness that, yes, this is going to make things marginally more inconvenient, but educate your staff that in making it marginally more inconvenient for them, it is significantly more inconvenient for the threat actor. We have a beautiful triangle visualization that we use, and we call it the security triangle. And on one end, it's got security, and on the next end, it's got accessibility, and then on the third end, it's got price. And the reason we use that visualization, we
choose two.
You can pick any two of these three. That's right. So it can be really secure and nice and accessible, but it's going to cost a lot of money. If you want it to be very secure and cost effective, you'll probably have half of your staff walk out and resign because the systems aren't usable. And I think there needs to be that nice little balance here. But going back to that scenario that you talked about a moment ago, one of the first thoughts that I usually have when these sorts of situations come up is, what else could have been done without necessarily having to go out and buy another product within the infrastructure that you've got? What else can be done that would have improved that security? And I remember having a conversation with someone once. We were talking about multi-factor authentication, and they said, my bank doesn't use MFA. What do you think I should do? And I said, I think you should change banks. And when they ask you why you're changing banks, tell them exactly why you're leaving. Because if enough people actually do that, then they'll get the message. And I think in regards to applications, and I suspect I know the application that you're talking about. We've probably got a handful of schools using it. It's very old code. So if it's old code and people are still using it and they're not maintaining the code and using current standards of security, then the only way to get the message across is to change platforms. And I know that that's not an easy change, but ultimately neither is a data breach, which is ultimately what the school had. So they've pretty much kicked the can down the road. And that's kind of the way I describe it. You got any thoughts on that?
Yes, it is one of the challenges of particularly businesses that we have, such as like medical practices, dental practices, any like community organizations, schools. They're really focused on delivering the service that they provide. And mostly they've been going for quite a long time. And so, they've set up this system in, 98 and it's kind of working well. And that's, because all they need to do is capture this data and, they've been capturing it and it's been added to little by little by little. But they're just so used to it and it's been, plugged in so long that they've not really recognized how much, I guess, the vulnerabilities have increased during that time and how much easier it is to exploit those vulnerabilities now. But I think at some point you just have to bite the bullet. And I appreciate it is a big expense and a big frustration. But at the same time, this school kind of got off lightly. I don't know how they didn't get in the press, to be honest with you. But a lot of other schools we've been with have not gotten off so lightly. They've had records for all the current students, but also former students going back, over a decade.
Yeah, wow.
You have to notify all those people. Private schools in particular tend to rely on their alumni networks, not just for networking, but actually for financial contributions.
Funding.
So you don't want to be going to your key base, your alumni, and to even the parents of your current students who are paying you usually around $40,000 per person per year and telling them, hey, your data's not safe. That freaks parents out. And it freaks out the former staffers or former alumni, and you're putting a lot at jeopardy just for not having simple security measures in place.
Well, I know there's a school that we work with and they were having some challenges before we started working with them. They appointed a new IT manager who luckily was able to obtain a larger IT budget and as a byproduct had improved the IT systems. And one of the key drivers they had is their students the parents of those students were paying a lot of money for those kids to be at school. And the parents were saying, we pay you all of this money. Why is the IT systems running as poorly as they are? So I get that. I completely get that.
It's not like when we went through, right, where we're sitting at desks without computers, looking at someone writing in chalk on a blackboard, It's changed a little.
Just a little. And we spoke very briefly on the way here about multi-factor authentication. You had an interesting question you asked around the Microsoft Authenticator side of things.
Yeah, so MFA 2 years ago was like the godsend, right? In terms of email compromises, people added MFA and it pretty much dried them up. And then threat actors learned how easily you could actually steal the MFA token, like literally a Control-C, Control-V, cut and paste to steal that token. We threw a man-in-the-middle attack. And then we saw BCs obviously go through the roof again. And then a few weeks ago, Microsoft's come out with its token protection. It is a bit involved. Like you do have to register the device with Entra and then you get essentially an encrypted token that sits on the device. But from then on, whenever you log in, it can only be logged in through that device. So your M365 environment, basically there can be no man-in-the-middle attack. Now, no doubt in a few years from now, some threat actor is going to figure out how to mimic the device and the token. But let's take the win while we can for the next few years, right?
That's right. And I think a lot of attacks these days are still opportunistic. I think if someone has enough motivation and resources, and when I say resources, I mean time and money, the system can be compromised. I certainly say to a number of my clients, if the Pentagon has the budget that they have and they can be breached, your budget will get you so far, but we cannot guarantee absolute protection, and I would be very concerned about anyone who does. I agree with you in regards to the Microsoft Authenticator. My team happens to be a big fan of the hardware tokens. They use YubiKeys. RSA has a fantastic product in this wheelhouse as well. But anything that we can do to improve the security posture With that marginal inconvenience, and you talked about the enrollment, it's primarily just the setup aspect of it. From that point on, it's pretty frictionless for the end user, but it is significantly harder for the threat actor. So I agree with you. Yes, there's going to be some time to set it up initially, and there might be some fantastic products out there where the security is to another higher level, but ultimately Microsoft has said, hey, here's a capability that we've now introduced. Why would an organization not want to take advantage of that?
And to their credit, they've put it on even low-level licenses, which is good because, I'm a big fan of Microsoft Intune, so actually enrolling the devices through that. But that was for higher license levels, and I understand why that wasn't as accessible for everyone and also did take a bit more technical knowledge to set up. But this, the fact that anyone can do it and set it up relatively easily and it's there included in your license already. I mean, for Google, I use passwordless, and essentially this phone through biometrics and essentially the Authenticator app is how I can get into my Google account. I'm all for that. I'm all for YubiKeys. For our domain controller in the office, I've got a YubiKey if we ever need access, if access is somehow taken away, and also a 50 multi-character break glass that's in a safe kind of thing. So you need all your options, and those can be inconvenient, but this enrolling the device, you do it once, and then that will protect your email account, at least for the few years until they figure out how to get around that.
And this is ultimately the price that we pay as a society for accessibility. If we wanted to keep these systems secure, we'd disconnect them from the internet, and someone who was motivated enough would have to walk into the building. But you just can't do business these days without connectivity. It's difficult to do business. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's very difficult to do business these days if you don't have email or internet. So unfortunately, this is just the side effect, the symptom of convenience.
No, I think with MFA, what we're talking really about is conditional access controls. This is one method. I think also something that gets overlooked a lot is just the value of geo-blocking, particularly we're talking about schools in specific here. If you're Brisbane Grammar, how often does someone need to log in from outside of Australia?
Absolutely.
There may be times, but that's fine. When they have to go away, you put them into a different user group that has access from whichever country they're going to. I can't imagine too many times when people from Nigeria or North Korea need to actually access the environment there.
Oh, that's my next overseas trip, actually. I'm heading to both of those countries.
Oh, Pyongyang. Here it's nice this time of year.
Yeah, apparently it is. I agree with you. Now, the threat actors, we talk about the evolution of that. And as you said a moment ago, yes, Microsoft has introduced this new style of communicating for identity management with regards to multi-factor authentication. No doubt the threat actors will catch up, and they're leveraging AI just as efficiently as, well, I'd say far more efficiently than most organizations are. And we'll park the AI part for a second. I'd really love to come back to that. But we've seen instances where the threat actors have now cottoned onto the fact that you've got geo restrictions in place. And so they'll now use a domestic grade VPN to come into the country that they know that you're from. And there is a solution for that as well. We have a tool. The short technical term for it is ITDR, but it's a security officer that's sitting there monitoring your tenancy for instances where you might be using a service that would otherwise be outside of the scope of that organization. So if you are transacting within Australia and all of a sudden you see IP addresses from a domestic or a freemium version of a proxy server accessing your Microsoft 365 tenancy, that's a good indication that there's a threat actor trying to do something, because legitimately, I cannot see a reason why a user within Australia would need to use a domestic grade VPN. You talked about logging. Those capabilities are only available if you've got the right logging in place, the right licensing in place, and the right partner in place that's actually monitoring those sorts of things. But yes, to your point, even those fundamental things, whilst they won't solve all problems, we're talking about taking a lot of that opportunistic threat actor style of activity off the table. They have to be more motivated. They have to subscribe to a service and use a freemium or a domestic VPN to come into the country, which costs them more time. Therefore, it's more inconvenient, it's more costly, when ultimately all they're doing is trying to monetize the outcome by casting the net as far and as wide as they possibly can.
Yeah, and the MO with threat actors, if we're talking specifically about email compromise, you see it every time. They might get access say even for 4 weeks. And what they do is they set up, mail forwarding rules to try and capture things like invoice, consignment, things like that, where they know there's going to be a financial transaction. Look for those emails, essentially spoof them, update the banking details, send that on to the client and try and intercept the payment. If they look around for a while and they go, okay, there's just nothing in Sean's mailbox about payments, then they'll just send out a phishing campaign to try and find new victims, and then they start all over again. And it really is that kind of process that they're just looking for financial documents and then phishing. And they keep on going. So if they have to be slowed down to go, okay, we found a victim. Okay, where is that victim? Okay, now we need to get a low-cost VPN in that environment. You're just slowing them down. The whole point is really not to be the low-hanging fruit. And so I think that, yeah, that's crucial. But as I say, if you had token protection involved, or you needed a YubiKey, or Intune, in my case, that solves that problem.
Yeah, and you mentioned about Intune before. It used to be on some of the higher tier licenses, and Microsoft's got a great bundle. Microsoft 365 Business Premium now includes Intune and conditional access policies. I'll half joke with my clients about what I refer to as the Microsoft tax, but in reality, this is what I refer to as the true cost of doing business. So if you want to do business online, you want to have a high security posture, you want to have very good logging in place, and all of these sorts of things. That's just the cost of doing business. And unfortunately, with the way these configurations are set by default, there are a lot of managed services providers who either don't know about those settings or haven't configured them for their clients. And I know so far the conversation's been about business email compromise, and there's a lot more that we can unpack outside of business email compromise. But the reason that it's as prevalent as it is because it's so easy. Microsoft is the cloud. It is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. And what would you say to the MSPs out there who have these capabilities, who haven't actually configured it, or at least had the conversation with the client? Because to configure it takes time and therefore costs money. Yeah,
let's just say that there's a broad range of quality when it comes to MSPs. Being, it's an unregulated environment, and you will get, I've had one matter where I remember they're like, okay, we'll get the MSP on the phone. I'm like, no worries, give me their details, I'll speak to them, find out what happened. And it was a regional country, a regional town, and the business name was Printing and Computers. And I'm like, oh God, computers isn't even first in their company name. And sure enough, they didn't have things set up. And I've had one MSP that had disabled logging because it's like, oh, it takes up too much space. I'm like, it really doesn't. And the problem with it without logging, so we had an email compromise with it was a regional medical center that did a lot of work with Indigenous communities, and they'd been provided information by the government for this. So as I say, like normally happens, threat actor gets in, look for anything financial. They go, okay, this is a whole bunch of just, medical information and history of abuse and things like that. No financial value here. Send out a phishing campaign to a whole bunch of new email addresses and just took off. And we could see they were in there so shortly. But because there was insufficient logging at this point, the government has said, no, we have to assume that all the data that we've sent you that was in that mailbox was compromised.
Yes.
So then going through that data analysis did actually cost like hundreds of thousands of dollars to go through. And then we were in a debate with the government agency for months because we're just like, this is not actually even going to be helpful to notify. And this went backwards and forwards. We ended up briefing council because we thought we were going to have to go to the Supreme Court to get them injuncted to stop them from, notifying the community and creating all this drama where there didn't need to be and where actually there was a much greater risk of harm from notifying. And all of this because logging was not enabled. You know what I mean?
But it's expensive and
yes,
takes up too much space.
Yeah, exactly. It's like literally check the box in the back end.
And most systems have a default setting in regards to that. Our recommendation to clients as a minimum is 12 months. And depending on the organization, depending on their security posture, we have organizations that have a requirement for logging that goes back a lot further than that. It really doesn't cost that much.
No.
In contrast to the revenue of the company, or in this case, we're talking about reputation damage and loss of income and things like that. It's the reality of the cost of doing business.
Yeah, just having a unified audit logs turned on for 365 days is nothing. Like, it really is nothing.
It's better than 30 days.
Yeah.
It's better than 7 or 14, as is the default in some cases.
I think a lot of people don't realize that the threat actors will get in quite some time, often before you find out about it. Let's say, because they might be, particularly if there is something of value in there, they will wait for the payments to be able to go through. And if they know that something's going to happen in 30 days, they will wait for that and then intercept and exploit it financially. And then it's only once they've done what they needed to do that they'll send out a phishing campaign, because they know that's when they'll be discovered. And so if your logging is 1 week, 2 weeks, 30 days, or just disabled, as is often the case, you're just flying blind, right? You can't figure out what the threat actor has done, what emails they've interacted with, and then you can't meet your obligations that you may have contractually to other parties that you work with, that you may have under the Privacy Act, like both at Commonwealth and state level, depending on the type of information. Or because of logging being disabled, it's quite frustrating.
Now, you made an interesting statement before about the cost of reviewing the information, which has come up. As you know, my firm we have professional indemnity for doing incident response for business email compromise. We've seen this, but I think it would be great for the listeners to hear from your perspective, why does the analysis cost so much money when you're looking at what we refer to as the digital artifacts for harm, personally identifiable information?
But I can give you some numbers that will help. A specific example that I was giving yesterday. So it was 92.5 gigabytes that had been exfiltrated. This was a ransomware attack, so different to an email compromise, but similar kind of thing where you have essentially a data set that needs to be analyzed. It ended up costing over $200,000 to go through all that data. And it's because you've got an obligation under the Privacy Act. If there's an eligible data breach, and I can get into that if you like, but if there is an eligible data breach, you have an obligation to basically notify the affected individual saying who you are, what happened, what data specifically on them was affected, and what they can do to remediate that risk. So you need to be able to analyze all these emails, all these files, depending on what it is, the attachments. Believe me, you can find anything on a file server or in a mailbox. And to find out, like, I have to be able to say, okay, Sean, we have your passport, or we have your credit card, or we have, your Medicare card. You have to be specific on those things. And then, like, if it is Medicare cards, when you get to a certain amount, you have to tell Services Australia. If it's driver's licenses, particularly some states are very, they really like to be informed when their driver's licenses are compromised. And so all that, you have to find out specific information. And there are tools that can automate a lot of it, but essentially what they will do is look at the 92.5 gig, do an early case assessment and say, we reckon we've identified personally identifiable information in these 40,000 documents. Then we'd also check a sample of the ones that they reckon they haven't found, just to double check that it hasn't just kind of slipped through. And then you kind of basically have to do a manual review of those 40,000 documents, which is a matter of going through every document and then go, okay, it's Sean, and it's a driver's license. Okay, check box. Okay, next document, what does this one have? Okay, this one has nothing. What does this one have? Oh, it has his address. Okay, put that in. What does this one have? And the process of going through that 40,000 times.
So it takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
And typically, what sort of resource is required to go through that process?
So we have, I think, about 35 casual staff at Emergence that we can draw on when we need to do a data review. And yeah, it is saying like that one, 92.5 gigs, $200,000.
And there's a cost to do that. And that's where having cyber insurance with an organization like Emergence Insurance, if that's covered under your policy where you've got access to incident response, they have resources that you've just mentioned and yourself available if an incident like this comes up. But otherwise, I've seen instances with organizations where they're dealing with lawyers and we're talking about a significant amount of time, and now we're talking about lawyer rates. And I know that I'm talking to a lawyer right now, but I'm sure that you can appreciate the statement that even whether it's a casual resource that you can dial into, there's still a significant cost in the time that's associated with that. And then you multiply that by what a law firm's going to charge you. It can be quite significant.
Absolutely. The lawyers do a very good job, to be honest.
They do a brilliant job.
They do it. They do it very efficiently as well. But yeah, you're paying a premium. There's no question about that.
So if we pivot the conversation now to on-prem infrastructure, we've talked about business email compromise. I remember having the conversation with the CEO, ironically, over a coffee, and the CEO said to me, Sean, I don't think we've got a lot of PII. I don't think we've got a lot of personally identifiable information in our environment. And you talked about some of these tools that you've got access to. We have the same tools. So after having our chat, we ran the tool over one of their 19 servers. Now, this organization has about 140 staff. So we're not talking small business. We're also not talking enterprise. But just on one of their 19 servers, we found PCI non-compliance, so credit card.
Yeah.
We found the tool that we use will assess for what the cost would be for first party and third party under a ransomware incident. $150 million Australian in equivalent PII.
Yeah. I'm kind of chuckle whenever people say we don't have any PII. We've just wrapped a matter actually with the school that was the first chat. So we always, as soon as something comes in, we all get together with a conference call and just talk through the matter. And this was another ransomware attack. And they're like, okay, so we know this server, this one is what was attacked. They didn't actually attack these other servers. They fortunately didn't move laterally. I think it's because they were interrupted. But they were like, no, on this server, no, there's just absolutely no PII whatsoever. And then the threat actor posted, I think it was 6 samples on the leak site. And like amongst the 6 samples was like passport, like tax file number, like declaration, and like just going, guys, you said you had none. They've posted 6 documents and like 4 of them have PII. Like, what are you doing here? So obviously you had to take a whole different approach to that. The amount of times I've heard we've got no PII. I know we only use that mailbox. It's the accounts thing. I've had ones where a guy had organised for his, church group to go on some weekend retreat or something, and he had used his business email for that. But it meant he had all the, health things about who was going and,
medical
ID
status.
documents and all this kind of stuff. You're going, yeah, trust me, you'd be amazed. Even if you think you are in the clear, you're likely still going to have information on your own staff and former staff as well. And that can be a lot of stuff. It can be, reasons why they were dismissed. Like you can find some quite juicy things, regrettably. But no, I always laugh when people are like, oh, there's no PII.
So there's certainly some value in being able to quantify the PII, personally identifiable information, and the risk so that you can put a mitigating strategy in place.
Whenever I talk about what makes like proper cyber security posture, one of the things has to be like your data governance. And you need to know like what are you holding, why are you holding it, are you actually lawfully allowed to hold it, and if you don't need it anymore, why is it still there? Because I'm kind of sympathetic in a way, because if you go back 5 years or probably 10 years, there was that idea that data was king. Everyone was trying to get every single bit of data they could, every point of information, because they were thinking, okay, this is going to help us project business opportunities. And maybe it would. But the thing is you're not entitled to hold data for that reason. Like that's against the Privacy Act, the Australian Privacy Principles. You can only hold data that people have given you consensually for the purpose that they've given it to you for, and you can only use it for that purpose. And
only for the duration that you're required. I know for us, we've got clients that have retained data, and we've gone through this process with some of them are taking quite a proactive and responsible approach to this, where they'll review the information that they've got and see if they need to keep as much of it. You mentioned about schools as an example. Whilst you have a student at school, you have a requirement for all of their medical information, so that if something happens and you need to call the ambulance or a doctor or anything like that, you need to know their status of their health. But as soon as they've left school, there's no legitimate reason for you to retain that information at all. Unfortunately, there's a time cost associated with doing a post-cleanup once those students have left. But going back to your point, you have a data protection officer. We refer to them as a data custodian. There needs to be time allocated for an organization to do that. And these days, anyone who hasn't done that, in my opinion, is taking a tremendous risk and kicking the can down the road. Because if they have a threat actor that comes in, whether it be through email or on traditional on-prem servers, there's a treasure trove of personally identifiable information that does, in a lot of cases, constitute serious harm available to them.
Yes, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, well, I guess the Information Commissioner herself, is taking Australian clinical labs to court at the moment. And it was purely that it's Australian Privacy Principle 11, deals with essentially securing systems and your data holding. And that's why they're being sued by the Information Commissioner, because they just held data that they didn't need to hold for too long. I mean, it's a $1 billion company or $1 billion turnover company. That's why they're a good target for a test case in a way to try and make an example. But you're going to see that more and more where the commissioner, and I presented with Carly at, so Carly Kind is the commissioner, at a law society conference last year. And she said to me specifically that she wants to change her focus on, rather than thinking about things like, did you have MFA in place? Because most people will. And also it's not necessarily as effective as it once was. But onto that, like, what are you doing with the data and why are you holding it? And one of the things that always baffles me as well is even if you do have a requirement to hold data, and I remember speaking to some people that provided public housing, and part of that is so long as you're providing public housing to that client, you actually have to keep all the information about the record of their time in that public housing. And some of them had lived there for like 30 years. And they're like, well, Pete, what do you reckon we should do with that? Like, we have a legal obligation to hold all this data. And I'm like, does it have to be internet facing? Like, does it have to be unencrypted? Like, if you are in a situation where, yeah, absolutely we need this data, it's like, how often do you actually need to access that data? And it's like, oh, no, it's just there in case something happens. I'm like, well, then, like, do it offline. Like, just move it offline.
Encrypt it, take it offline,
yeah,
do both.
Like, exactly. And if for whatever reason you do need to access it, bring that, connect it back online, check that one record, and then go back offline. It's kind of like with backups, when people, they go, oh, no, we've got multiple backups. I'm like, are they connected to the same network? Like, yeah. I'm like, well, mate, that NAS is not going to do a job of a backup.
And I think you've really reiterated the importance of that security, accessibility, price paradigm that we talked about. So taking the information that's no longer needed offline certainly is going to make it more inconvenient, going back to the accessibility for your staff on the rare occasion that they may need to access it. But in making it marginally inconvenient for your employees, you have now made it significantly more difficult for a threat actor to access it. If they wanted to, they would then physically have to come to the office and potentially physically access either a different system or maybe an offline form of media. So it is a marginal inconvenience for your employees and a significant level of inconvenience for the threat actor.
And you want to know what's really inconvenient? That matter I was just talking about with the 92.5 gigabytes, we found out about that in mid-January because data was posted on the leak site relating to this health provider. I still had calls about it last Friday because the government has still got questions and they have different opinions on notifications that should be done. So that's been going on for, 8 months. That's an inconvenience.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And I think some of it also comes down to, I know some of the debates I've seen with different organizations around what does or doesn't constitute serious harm, whether there's an obligation for the organization to notify under Notifiable Data Breach Act. And in some cases, I just sit there and I think to myself, folks, what's the right thing to do?
Yeah, this is a challenge. So for people that are unfamiliar with what the criteria are for an eligible data breach, so this is the Notifiable Data Breach Scheme that came into power in 2018, the amendment to the Privacy Act. I mean, it's kind of funny that we've got a Privacy Act in 1988. It's just like, this is a different world than 1988. It's a different world, to be honest, than 2018. But basically it says an eligible data breach is whenever there's unauthorized access to, disclosure of, or loss of personally identifiable information, and that a reasonable person would conclude that that unauthorized access, disclosure, or loss is likely to result in serious harm to the affected individual, and whether you've not been able to do anything to remediate that risk. And so there's a lot of interesting words there, like likely to cause serious harm. Even the unauthorized access or disclosure is not as clear-cut as you think. Just because a threat actor, has gone in, exfiltrated 92.5 gigs and encrypted the server, doesn't mean that they've actually gone through and looked at 92.5 gigs, those 40,000 documents. They almost certainly haven't. But out of an abundance of caution, the position of the commissioner, and she's entitled to this, has said, no, we just have to assume that all of that data has essentially been accessed. even though it's almost 0% chance that they actually have. But then when you look at likelihood of serious harm, like likely is the balance of probabilities. It can't be just a remote chance. Then if you've got likelihood to cause serious harm, there are some things that I think are a slam dunk. Like if you've got a credit card with the CVV and the expiry date, yeah, that is likely to cause serious harm. Like,
or your tax file number.
But it's even the tax file numbers, while I do think it's appropriate to notify people and to put protections in place like you can through the ATO, I still think if you actually look at that likely to cause serious harm, so if you think if your tax file number was exposed, it's more likely than not, better probability, like 50% plus one, that you are actually going to have serious harm. And to be honest, the serious harm wouldn't even be to you, because what ends up happening, so your tax file numbers are used because people get in through your MyGov, they then go back to your old tax returns, they change your banking details, and they change your deductions and get the refund into their new bank account. That's how that scam occurs. But the debtor, the person losing the money ends up being the tax office. So you could argue even that the serious harm is not caused to the affected individual.
Yes. Yeah, I think the approach that I was taking in regards to that comes down to identity theft and things like that. I've certainly heard scenarios where people have had some of their identity stolen and now they've got bad debt ratings, credit card information, new credit cards that have been set up and things like that.
Something comes down to likelihood. So I think on a strict reading of the Act, you could say that an eligible data breach almost never occurs. However, I mean, that's certainly not the position of the Commissioner. And that's not our position either. We always have an abundance of caution. We will notify if there's any driver's license, Medicare card, passport, anything like that, health information, if it's a health provider, tax file numbers, we'll always notify. But that's not, I mean, I think it's doing the right thing essentially as a corporate citizen, but it's also good business practice. Like, I think there's an expectation from your staff and from your clients that if they've provided this information to you and it has been involved in a breach, you have almost a moral duty to them, I think, to let them know, regardless of what the black letter it says in Section 26 of the...
It's the right thing to do. Often this comes up in conversation whenever we're doing an assessment around business email compromise, and the organisation would say to us as a managed services provider, what should we do? Our typical position from here is to contact your legal counsel. Typically, the people that would engage us to do that haven't got cyber or don't have incident response as part of their policy, which is why we're involved. Because if they had insurance coverage with Emergence, it would be your team handling the business email compromise, not us, because they have a policy with you. But because of the way the wording is and the interpretation of the wording, that's why we, as a managed services provider, just say you're best to talk to your legal counsel in regards to that. Have you got an opinion on that?
Oh, absolutely. If for nothing else, if I was a business owner and had a data breach, I'd want to get, even if I really believed it wasn't notifiable, get a lawyer to give their opinion, give their advice, and get it on their letterhead. And that way you're essentially protected if you were to get investigated by the Information Commissioner, which is extremely rare. However, people can make complaints themselves directly to the OAIC. And if that happens, questions will be asked. If you can then say, we knew we had a breach, that's why we sought legal advice. Here's the advice you received, that there's no notifiable data breach. You're not going to be the one that gets in trouble. Even if anything did occur, which I think wouldn't, you're covered by the PI, like the indemnity insurance of the law firm. So, shift the risk. And that's why insurance is good, right? It's just about shifting risk.
Absolutely. You're outsourcing your risk to, or offsetting your risk, I should say, to a third party in that aspect. We've had another colleague of yours who presented about a year ago on an organisation that was compromised, and your client had the ability to restore all of their information from backup, even though it was a ransomware incident. But the decision was made to still pay. Maybe we can or maybe we can't talk about this one on the podcast.
No, I can. I can say, I'm not going to get into the specifics of the matter, but what I will say is that we probably pay about 10 to 15% of the time on a ransomware attack. The reason usually, and I'm happy to actually go through the whole ransom thing because there's quite a lot of considerations that go into play.
If you could, that'd be great.
So firstly, like we have a reluctance to pay ransoms on an ethical basis. Like there's no doubt that every single time we pay a ransom, we're encouraging that behavior. Like the more that threat actors are able to make money from it, the more they're going to keep doing it. You know, the Australian government itself recommends not paying ransoms, though there is not an actual prohibition on it. There's an obligation now, if you're a business with a turnover above 3 million since May, there's been an obligation to notify the government and tell them, I think, quite an extensive list of details, to be honest, which I think is a bit rough. But that aside, there is ethical problems against paying it. There's also legal problems. So what's called the instruments of crime provisions, which is if you give money or resources to a criminal and they use that to perpetrate further crime, that is in itself a crime. There's also terrorism funding, which, you know, is certainly a concern now. A lot of threat actor groups are from places like Iran and Russia in particular. And ever since, obviously, the invasion of Ukraine and with Iran's actions, there's definitely a grey area. And, you know, terrorism, it's just anything that's done for a religious, political or ideological motivation. And if you're the Islamic Republic of Iran, it's pretty hard to argue there's not some religious motivation there. With Russia, you're on a tightrope there, right? Like you're right on the edge, and particularly because people think of terrorism as like a car blowing up in the street, but it can be as simple as taking down a computer network. Can be a terrorist act. So we're very nervous about where money is going. There is a defence there of duress in the criminal code, which basically means you can commit a crime if it's to stop the commission of a worse crime. And so whenever we pay, it really does come down to this duress thing. It's where the company's facing an existential threat because all its data is encrypted, all its backups are encrypted. It just cannot operate as a business, and that's putting the very livelihood of all the staff and the owners at jeopardy. And so therefore, paying the $75,000 US may be a lesser crime than letting this business collapse and all these people lose their jobs. And that's usually a key consideration in when we'd pay. It's that moment where the company is facing an existential threat. Even once you get past that legal hurdle, you do have to look at the sanctions regimes. And again, since Russia invaded Ukraine, that has completely ballooned. So there's a number of lists that would check, from the US, UK, obviously Australia's ones, EU, the United Nations. Make sure if there's any naming of these groups on any of those lists or any individuals associated with them, then we will not pay at all. Then also directors need to know their duty of care and diligence as well. So ultimately the decision to pay the ransom has got to come from the director. And we, as an insurer, actually make them pay the ransom and then we'll reimburse them if it's, legally compliant.
Interesting.
So now all of that is just basically to get to the decision to pay the ransom. Only twice in our history have we ever paid for non-publication. So nearly always it's because the company is facing an existential threat, but 2 times it's for non-publication because the sensitivity of the data was so extreme that, well, one, it had data to do with an ongoing litigation, and that would have been extremely prejudicial if that was out there. And the other one, it had information on community groups that if that information got out there, there was real fears of like a lateral violence within the community. So we thought for the safety of the staff of this community group and for the safety of the community, it did justify paying the ransom. But I said that's twice in our entire history that we've paid for non-publication. So that's a long answer to your question, sorry.
And I appreciate that. I think the listeners will really appreciate the depth of response that you've given. So out of curiosity, in those 2 instances where you've paid, what were the reassurances that you had that the information that they had access to wouldn't be used anyway?
Believe it or not, both times they provided a screen capture of like the Linux screen where they're going through and deleting all the folders and information. Now, obviously, we have no way of knowing whether they
have a duplicate copy. Yeah.
And for that reason, we still went through all of our privacy obligations and notifications as though the data was still out there. Generally, this will sound weird, but the threat actors usually are very concerned about their reputations and are very good to deal with. So I've never had one where we haven't received a decryptor. I've even had where we're having troubles with the decryptor and there was like, post-sale customer service where you could get on there and you discuss it with them and they were giving you, steps to try this and use this command, or try that, which, people don't think of, I think, threat actors as big business and having customer care. It really is. When you look at the kind of supply chain that makes up a ransomware attack, it starts all the way from like initial access brokers that get in, the affiliates that actually kind of manage the attack, and the data managers who control the data once it's exfiltrated. You've got the negotiators that are involved, obviously the software developers. There's even call centers. We get a guy called Andrew quite often rings up, he supports Akira and a few others, and we'll ring up and actually be telling staff, we know you've got your data, we want you to negotiate with us, and puts pressure on. And then finally at the end, even when they get paid, it's a whole operation to turn Bitcoin into cash, so the money laundering to get access to that information. I think certainly some countries turn a bit more of a blind eye to money getting withdrawn from their exchanges. But yeah, it's just a big business, and there's all these steps that get into it. And the threat actors know that their reputation is crucial. There's one recently called Qilin, which is Russian despite having a Chinese fantasy character's name, where it's now come out that there is some associations with them and, funding essentially sanctioned entities. And so now we're like, we will not touch them at all. Like we would never consider a payment now that we know that there's some links to sanctioned entities. So their reputation is now shot. So they will, inevitably what will happen is they'll come back as a new group. But the due diligence that we go through, even when someone phoenixes, we will look at the ransomware binary and see if that is the same as a binary that used to be used by a sanctioned entity. Like if we see Conti code come up, if we see Qilin code come up, we will just not touch that as well. So we go through a lot of due diligence to make sure that we're not breaching those sanctions regimes.
So when you say you look at the binary as an example for the non-technical listeners, you're talking about
the actual code,
the fingerprint, and seeing if there is traces of within that executable that they've used similarities to a fingerprint that's been used somewhere else.
Yeah. So essentially, and this obviously is above my pay grade, but I know what they do. So they get the binary, and so the company we work with, they get the binary, and then they essentially reverse engineer it to see how it's operating, so you can understand it better. But yeah, then they will actually look at the code and we'll look for it if, there are bits and pieces used elsewhere. Because, as you know, groups, Black Cat becomes Alfie, these are, they do go along. But the other thing I'd say about the reputation, they are actually very good. Like they do deliver the decryptors, they will assist you if it doesn't work. We've never had data published after we've paid.
Well, really, the only business model that they have for this to work is that people pay, and people aren't going to pay if they don't get their information back. So it is honour amongst thieves in a certain instance, really, isn't it?
And they know that there's no other recourse. Like if it was a normal business relationship, you can sue someone for failure to deliver. But because you don't have that recourse with the threat actor, people are already extremely reluctant to pay in the first place. So their reputation has to be like squeaky clean, which is a very strange thing to say about criminal organizations that, fleece billions of dollars a year.
So if you're engaging with these threat actors whenever a cyber incident occurs, you have a historical reference point as to whether they have or haven't paid. So it's very risky for them to actually provide a decryption key that doesn't work and then not help to resolve that issue through customer service. Like you said, it's a full business model. Because in their mind, I'm assuming that they would know that they're likely to come up against you for a conversation at some stage down the track. And if you go, we paid you money and we didn't get it last time, then that's their whole negotiation posture dead in the water.
Yeah, whenever we need to negotiate, and again, I said, it'll only be like 10 to 15% of the time. Sometimes we'll just negotiate in bad faith to try and get a file tree to figure out, what they've taken. We always will use professional negotiators who this is all they do. And so they have a significant, repository of essentially cyber threat intelligence. And it will be that. They'll be like, okay, it's Akira. Okay, we've done 32 matters with Akira in the past 12 months. We've noticed that their behavior actually did change. And this is all true from like November, where they started being a bit more aggressive on the pricing they were setting and how much they would negotiate down. But because they've done so many negotiations, they know what will be successful and what won't be successful. They know how much margin you've got. So last time, which actually is not that long ago, the first offer I think was $930,000 and we got them at 140 or 130. And that's because they knew essentially how long it would take. And we had backups. It wasn't so much a time pressure for us. It was just, there was some data that was missing relating to one server that we really needed, but it didn't affect business operations in the short term. So we could go, okay, stretch it out for 3 weeks, that's fine. And then in the end, they're getting desperate and they're going, okay, we'll take 130,000 because it's better than nothing.
Which is, in some cases, frankly, what they'll get if the organization restores from backup.
Yeah, well, we did. That was interestingly what we did look through is how much would it cost for us to completely rebuild that system and try and get information, speaking to clients and speaking to other business partners and trying to patch it all together. And it would have been close to $1 million.
So for the MSPs or the internal IT department that might be tempted to start rebuilding the environment from backup if they can, what would your advice to them be? General advice, because every circumstance is different.
I mean, ideally, if you're in the cloud, you just spin up a new instance. I know it's going to cost you, obviously, money to do that. But otherwise, get a hard drive, take an image of it. The main issue is evidence preservation. And this has happened multiple times where the MSP or internally just restores everything for backups because, they want to get business operational and everything, no one notices, everything's good. They fixed it over the weekend. But then 6 weeks later, data gets posted on the dark web and it's like, okay, what has happened here? And you can't find out what has happened here. Also people restore from bad backups, then realize the threat actor got in 6 months ago. So the best thing to do really is to get in contact with, if you're insured, ideally, get in touch with them. If you're not, speak to forensics investigators that can get in and make sure that the system is secure and take all the information they need. There's good applications out there that can, like Cape, that can take all the important logging, or FDK Imager to take an actual forensic image of the server. But you should really just speak to someone who's a specialist in this area before you touch anything, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've heard instances with other insurance providers who refuse to pay the policy as a byproduct of the fact that they weren't contacted as part of the incident response and they weren't able to do their investigation as a byproduct of the fact that the MSP had...
Yeah, strictly within the law, Section 54 of the Insurance Contracts Act says that if the insured does something to prejudice the response, then you don't have to cover the extent of that prejudice. While that's the law, you don't necessarily want to be litigious because I think you want to have a great relationship with all your customers, and sometimes that means some get through. Yeah, and that's why we'd rather focus on education, telling people, hey, just call us immediately. This is the whole reason why you have insurance, is so that when you have a crisis, you've got someone to talk to who's been through it hundreds of times before.
So let's talk about education for a moment. What are the typical things that you would say an organisation should do, or the things that you've seen are the most frequent low-hanging fruit that is often overlooked by a business that they could address to minimise the probability of having a threat actor within their environment?
To have the threat actor within their environment, obviously the most education, that the key things are the obvious ones like being aware of phishing, being aware of scams, being aware of payment redirection and things like that won't happen. But I guess it's just education more broadly in a sense of being skeptical and questioning, why things are happening, how they are happening, and does that seem normal? And if anything, just to elevate things, escalate things when you do see something that isn't normal. That's probably just education for general life, right? Like if you see something that doesn't seem right, say something. And I think that's the most important. It's really hard though to teach common sense, and that is a challenge. And you're always going to have people fall for scams, and people are getting better at it. The threat actors are getting better at it. We had one matter where it was a property transaction, and someone had called up impersonating the bank, and had convinced the employee to hand over the multi-factor authentication codes to put through this whole transaction, and it was $3.1 million. So you'd think if there was ever a time where you'd go through all of your safety measures, double check, go, hey, boss, does this seem right? Didn't happen because the person on the phone, which was in a British accent, which is kind of interesting, because usually they're Eastern European, it was very believable and they fell for it. I mean, I feel quite bad for this employee because surely if you lost 3.1 million, you'd almost just tender your resignation, right? You'd fall on your sword. Amazingly, about 6 months later, the bank recovered the money. So
wow.
Incredible. But, it's very rare. But, just teaching that kind of common sense, like, does this seem right? Would the bank call us for this? Like, if the bank is really calling, okay, let me call the bank back and, and speak to my account manager and we'll discuss whatever needs to be discussed.
And if I'm going to call the bank back, I'm not going to call them from the number that just showed up on my phone. I'm going to go to the bank's website and find the numbers that are listed on the bank and call them on the number that's listed, not just hit call back.
What is amazing, sometimes the threat actors are pretty good and you've got to give them a bit of credit. So there was a bank for a while that threat actors had managed to set up a fake website for this certain bank, and on Microsoft Edge, they managed to SEO it, so it was the first response when you actually searched for that bank. So I'm like, okay, that's a pretty good scam.
It's quite resourceful.
If you're actually able to get in there and go, look, there's a small percentage of people who use Edge, and there's a small percentage of people who are going to use Edge and also use this bank. And when they search for it, they're going to get the fraudulent number, and we're going to be able to perpetrate it. And the way they do that is it's part of to add veracity. When they will ring you, they'll say, look, we don't want you to fall for a scam. So what I want you to do is, open your browser,
go to
search,
Edge.
search for the bank. And, there's a small enough percentage that will just automatically be on Edge, and we'll search the bank and then call back. And then they're like, yeah, okay, just give this reference number. And, I can see how someone would fall for that scam.
Well, in a certain instance, they're disarming your concern by saying, don't take my word for it. We know that scams exist.
Go
Call
search.
the bank, go search. And so that's the importance of the awareness training in checking the URL for its absolute accuracy to verify there. I remember once I made a transaction and the bank called me within 5 minutes of sending the money through. And they said, I'm from XYZ Bank. And I said, fantastic. And I didn't recognize the number that was on my phone. I said, how do I know that you're from XYZ Bank? And it was just a exercise in their understanding of how easy it is for non-technical people to be tricked up in regards to this stuff. They said, well, you can just call us back. And I said, okay, but is the phone number that you've called me on listed on the bank's website? And they said, that's a really good question. And they struggled from that point on to try and provide me with some sort of continuity of how I could call them back on one of the listed numbers on their website to get to the right department and quote a reference number. And that's someone who works in this industry. I can't imagine how challenging it can be for people who are outside this industry and how easy it can be sometimes for them to be tripped up.
There's a lot of little tricks as well that threat actors will do. So say like in an email compromise, they will search for including things like a bank statement. Because as soon as you have the bank statement, you ring up and you go, g'day, Sean, this is Peter from ANZ. I'm calling because we actually had a problem with your transaction last Thursday that you sent through for $37,612. And you're like, okay, yeah, why? What's been the problem? Well, we're actually going to need to revert, like anything like that. And you're just going, okay, they know my name, they know my bank, like they know my address, they know this transaction, they know the date. All of that is just because they found a bank statement in an email.
Social engineering, right? They've got a little snippet of information that they've been able to then use against you. I brought up AI right at the start of the conversation, and no doubt the sophistication that you're seeing now with some of these things. I've seen examples where the spelling and the grammar for phishing campaigns is almost absolute poetry now as a byproduct of threat actors using AI tools far more efficiently than a lot of organizations are. Where have you seen AI being used by threat actors?
Definitely on the phishing emails. Like it used to be, I am bank and I need money now. And you're like, okay, thanks, Yoge. It's not that. Like, so definitely that is assisted, but I think that's just the simple kind of ChatGPT kind of thing. Where we are going to see it more, and it's hard to know from our side how much it's being used yet by threat actors, but I can see where you could say, imagine teaching AI on the CVE, so the common vulnerabilities and exposure database, of which there's tens of thousands of vulnerabilities. where it explains what the vulnerability is, how to fix it, which also kind of says how to unfix it, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine you train AI on that, and then you just point it at an IP address and go, okay, go for it. And it can try, 40,000 different things very quickly. I think that's definitely going to be the problem as it rolls out, is that, as soon as, I think just pointing it at specific environments, trying all the CVEs, or just learning, being smarter, finding its own exposures, seeing where you can remote code execute. Or similarly, I think just, the fact that if you can get away from essentially, hands-on keyboard, you can just try and exploit so much more. So even as soon as like a CVE comes out, I mean, we've had people, there's so many things to say here, but like when you talk about on-prem, a lot of people move their Exchange servers into the cloud, which is a great thing, but they just didn't decommission their servers properly. So they sat there and, Exchange server had the proxy shell vulnerability, and we're having people that were exploiting that like 18 months after the patch was provided. And they just didn't have a good patching regime, or they hadn't decommissioned the server properly. I can see AI being brutal on that.
Weaponizing it.
Yeah, just going, okay, here's a proxy shell vulnerability as an example, or whatever the next proxy shell one is, the next CVE, and just kind of interacting with something like, Shodan, which is a kind of Google of the Internet of Things, if you will, where you can search for like every device that has this or that and just exploits them all. Basically just goes nuts and finds the ones that aren't patched, and could just do it in such a rapid rate of time that, you wake up the next morning and just go, what do you mean? This patch only came out 4 hours ago, and what?
Or in some cases, leveraging AI to find zero-day vulnerabilities.
Which surely it's going to be good at it, right?
Absolutely. Particularly if the more source code you feed it and the more vulnerabilities that you educate it with, the more efficient it's going to become at identifying and finding more vulnerabilities in the future.
I mean, it's already known to be good at coding, AI. So again, before when I said we reverse engineer the ransomware binaries to see if there's code that overlaps, I could see quite easily you just put that code in, you go, I want to maintain this functionality, but I need it coded in blah. And we'll go, okay, that's entirely fresh code, same functionality. That gets very hard to detect.
Which makes it very, very hard for endpoint security and antivirus products to detect if it's constantly changing.
I mean, this is probably when we say about the balance of convenience, I'm obviously really quite strict with EDR. I'm like, you shouldn't be able to exfiltrate data. You shouldn't be able to encrypt data. You shouldn't be able to move laterally, or it should be an alert should go when this happens, and it has to get approved by your SOC. And I'd love everyone to have EDR and a SIEM and a SOC, but that's obviously not viable for everyone. That is the expense in your triangle. Very, very good though. But yeah, I think AI, I don't know, it's going to be a little bit overwhelming, which I probably think you need to move then to like a zero trust model where you just we actually just don't let anyone in. We've realized that we can segregate nearly everything that we do as a business, and then we'll whitelist to this thing that's almost like a jump box that can then connect as needed. And basically everything's going through this very strict firewall with one eye. I think that's the only way you can really do it.
And let's retain incredibly good logging on this machine that's got access to everything else.
But most of what you're doing, I suspect a lot of businesses, most of what you're doing, you could actually really segregate.
Yeah, I think it just comes down to that convenience. I know that there are some people that I've worked with in the 3 decades that I've been in the industry who they know a little bit more than the average user, but I know when we've stress tested them for job interviews and things like that, they're what we refer to as a textbook techie. They can recite the response that's in the textbook, but when you put them on the tools and actually get them to do the job, that's where they fall down. And I've seen instances with technical people who don't even understand the brevity of the hole that they've just created because they put in place what they thought was a fix. It was actually just a Band-Aid and a workaround, and just gone, oh, that'll do. And it's like, hang on, what are you doing there? Do you understand what you've just done could be a security incident? And that's part of the challenge. We've got this education base. There's the challenge with upskilling and training your team internally and security products that they need to be aware of. But threat actors are motivated by the financial return, which in a lot of cases is far greater than the salary that commercial organizations or even big enterprise can can pay.
I've definitely paid more ransoms than I've earned in my time. But, it's amazing how, people for convenience sake will make a small decision that seems like incidental. But the truth is that, unfortunately, on our side, we have to get it right every single time. They just need to get it right once. And so I have one example where an MSP looked after a lot of environments, but he had its own RMM server, then our insured server. And the threat actor got in and was trying to exfiltrate data, and there were the right controls in place, so you couldn't exfiltrate data from our client's environment. However, on the RMM service, the remote monitoring and management, or managing and monitoring.
Remote monitoring and management?
They had a problem with, it was Windows Defender that was running, and they were clashing with each other, so they just took Windows Defender off. And so then the threat actor was just able to move all the data, stage it on the RMM server, and exfiltrate it with no problems. So someone's going, oh, this is just the RMM server, this is fine, there's no real threat here, we can disable Windows Defender.
Because disabling a security product is always a great idea, right?
Rather than figuring out why there's a clash.
Let's spend that accessibility component. Let's invest the time, understand why it's doing what it's doing, and then harden and secure it accordingly. And I was working with an incredibly well-known software vendor a couple of weeks ago, and I was watching their programmers failed to do security checks on the executables, the binaries that they were downloading while they were doing troubleshooting. And at one stage, they downloaded files directly off the internet and they were about to execute them on a production system. And it's sheer fluke that the time was allocated to observe and watch what they were doing. Stop. What are you doing? Why are you doing that? Now, if I mention the name of this organization, we're talking similar sort of caliber to the SolarWinds supply chain data breach that occurred many, many years ago. This software is installed on enterprise organizations, medium business. It's internationally recognized, and it's a brand that's synonymous with reliability. And yet there's an absence of training, or for the people that were on the service desk, the depth of understanding of the risks that they were implementing as a byproduct of just general troubleshooting. I'm astounded by that.
I'm amazed that any company would let an executable that is not whitelisted operate, to be honest with you. And again, I appreciate that can have some level of inconvenience, but boy, like you say, the SolarWinds example, this is a good example of how vulnerable even secure environments can be. So for those that don't know, SolarWinds basically, which is an RMM tool, I believe, isn't it?
Yes, they purchased an RMM.
Yeah.
The supply chain came through one of their other tool sets.
Yeah, and then it was the scheduled update, right? So when the patches just got rolled out, and particularly across a lot of US government departments, for me, the fact was, US Department of State got sprung by it, and it took them 9 months to discover.
And Microsoft.
But it concerns me, because we know who's behind the SolarWinds attack, but not trying to get political here. But this country was in the Department of State's environment for 9 months. So basically every bit of data that they needed, they're just, and think about how you can use that to try and influence elections. And this is all very politically motivated. That's just staggering. And if you're the US Department of State and you can get, you can get popped, guess what? Anyone can.
And that goes back to making it inconvenient, understanding that it's possible that it's going to happen, ensuring that you have the appropriate logging in place, and then having contingency plans for the unfortunate reality that it's likely going to happen to a lot of organizations. I want to pivot just for a moment. Do you see any particular industries that you insure, or do you see this in terms of breaches, whether it's business email compromise or on-prem traditional servers? Is this any specific vertical, or is this just general, or is it a particular industry size? What are you seeing out there in the last? As
you mentioned before, it is opportunistic. And so I think threat actors really do, it's wherever the phishing email hits. So sometimes it'll be like a florist, and they just have no real data and it's of no value, and then they'll send out a phishing campaign and move on. Where the harm is caused, though, is for us, any kind of medical, dental, anything like that, community services, financial services, where you have data that either is very sensitive because of its, health nature, or financial because it can be exploited. That's where we see the most harm Schools are a perfect example of just having a ton of data that's problematic. But it's not so much that threat actors, I believe, are targeting the industries. They're opportunistic, and they see who they come across. Because I've seen everything from, like garage door installer, actually not far from here, who was hit, to, a company that milled timber to build frames for houses. Like, so they're not, you wouldn't think, normal targets for a threat actor, but they got hit. The only exception to that, I'd say, is critical infrastructure, where there's clearly an aggressive approach being taken by certain countries to infiltrate our critical infrastructure network. And that's why you've seen changes to the Act, like the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, why you're seeing government and now even having the authority to just come in and run the company and run the response, basically. And there's a huge fear that there's a lot of backdoors being put in. So should we ever be in a situation where we needed to have a military conflict with one of these countries, they will do things like turn off the power grid. And that's deeply concerning.
Well, we saw instances where with Amazon Web Services going down, we couldn't fill our cars. We couldn't, when we had the CrowdStrike issue, we had planes that couldn't take off. And
that wasn't even malicious.
That's correct. That wasn't even malicious. And I have a whole opinion in regards to a lot of these organizations having ISO 27001 and failing certain controls under the ISO 27001 construct and yet being able to operate. But there were supermarkets where basically you couldn't transact. So what are you giving food away because you can't charge people for it? This is all critical infrastructure. So yeah, I agree with you in regards to that. I've got an organization that we had a conversation with around our understanding of where they sat with SOCI, Security of Critical Infrastructure. And I was amazed to see them backpedal when we talked to them about their what we referred to as potential obligations, because again, we're a managed services provider. We're not a law firm. And so our recommendation to them was to go and seek advice on their determination from a SOCI perspective. And when we gave them what we determined to be the requirements to comply with SOCI, the response I got back was, Sean, that's about 5% of our annual profit. And in my mind, I thought to myself, yeah, but you're now protecting 95% of the rest of your profit, but you're also under these obligations.
Yeah, it's not optional.
It's not optional.
Yeah.
And so that organization in particular was trying to duck and weave around what their obligations are. Have you seen anything like that before?
No, just because I know like ACSC, who oversees it, and the National Office of Cybersecurity, they don't take this as a laughing matter at all. Like any SOCI entity who doesn't comply is really running the risk of coming into the ire of the government, and they will use their teeth on this because they know it's a threat to national security at this point. Like things that might seem simple, but imagine you can't get milk. You got to think, people will survive without milk. You would be surprised how much you can unravel a society just because there's currently no milk.
Well, I think we saw that in COVID with toilet paper, didn't we?
Yeah. So it might seem innocuous, but then you think if they do take out the electricity grid, and it's just amazing now because everything has such a supply chain that just the failure to have this one little segment can mean that this whole operation fails. So just this one little supplier, if they're going, oh yeah, no, I've got SOC obligations, so it doesn't really matter. That might be the critical link that actually does mean this whole other thing falls over. And that is a problem. I'd highly advise them to become compliant.
Well, in that instance that you use as an example, they're the Achilles heel in the whole supply chain. You take that down and it has a flow-on effect, downstream, upstream, but ultimately to the community as a whole. And
the Achilles heel is a good visual analogy when you think about it. Like, think about how small your Achilles is, but if that tendon is cut, you're done. Like, you're not walking anywhere. Like, you're just rolling in the floor in pain.
Peter, we have a few minutes left before we wrap up for today.
Yep.
Is there anything else in particular that you would like to talk about?
I think we have covered most things. I think the most important thing, and your listeners are already doing it, or viewers are already doing it just by being here, is to be aware of the threat. For me, one of the big problems is that only about 10 to 15% of businesses still have cyber insurance or have even considered things like having an incident response plan and a business continuity plan. A lot of people just aren't thinking cyber yet, which is obviously from our perspective, because we think about it all the time, quite baffling. But the reality is, you don't know what you don't know. So, obviously I'm preaching to the choir here, but I'd love for those that do know to point out to the others that don't know a little bit about it so they can start considering it. We've seen ASIC is starting to go after directors who are not taking their duty of care and diligence seriously by being adequately informed on matters to which they're making decisions of, and that includes cybersecurity. The days are gone when you can run a company and be like, I've got, someone else is looking after that. No. If you're running the company, you have an obligation, you have a duty. And ASIC is going to start slamming companies that don't take that seriously. So, yeah, those that do know, I think, can do a big favor to the rest of the country and the community by letting them know the risk that is out there and how they should take it seriously and address it.
I would also add, for the managed services providers that are listening, have a conversation with your clients. Talk to them about the importance of them having a cyber incident response plan. If you can, have a copy of their cyber incident response plan, because the worst place to have a SERP stored when an incident occurs is on the infrastructure that's down. And I'd also suggest to the MSPs having the conversation around cyber insurance, the cost or the investment in having a cyber policy and having the wealth of resources that the listeners have heard about today. It's an incredibly good investment. Accessing those for a breach can easily rack up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars versus, depending on the size of the organization, a policy that's a very small percentage of that cost. And of course, your team handles incident response on a frequent basis, therefore far better equipped to respond to an event, a cyber event, if and when it occurs.
Yeah, absolutely.
And don't tamper with the infrastructure if a breach occurs.
And leave the evidence intact.
Leave the evidence intact. Yeah. Peter, I'd like to thank you for your time today. It's been a very interesting exchange of experiences. Coming at it from a legal perspective, I think sheds an interesting lens on things. It's been great. I really appreciate your transparency, and I'm sure the people that are watching and listening to this will appreciate that as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here.